Welcome to the Telling of Story podcast. I'm your host, storyteller Jules, and along with my guests, it's my endeavour to explore the art and science of storytelling to attract, engage, and retain a business audience, and to unpack why it works for some and not for the many that try. In this episode, I have the pleasure of talking with Rowdy McLean. Listen in as he talks about what he thinks is the most important thing in storytelling.
I think the most powerful thing of all in storytelling is the pause.
Australia's 2019 Keynote Speaker of the Year, Rowdy has delivered over 1,000 keynote presentations to over 700,000 people in 17 countries. A master storyteller, a genuine bloke, and someone that people from all walks of life can relate to. Rowdy played professional sport, built a successful startup, turned around a failing company, founded 5 companies, and mentors and works with leaders from the world's top organisations daily. Rowdy has also climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, kayaked in Antarctica, tracked gorillas in Rwanda, run marathons, and hiked the caco track. The combination of business and personal challenges makes his presentations interesting and unique. A best-selling author and founder of the Leadership Institute Australia, Rowdy is the go-to speaker on how to shift mindsets, raise the bar, embrace change, and crack the code for extraordinary future success. Rowdy, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on, mate.
Rowdy, take me back to where you grew up and what is it famous for?
I grew up in a little tiny country town on the northern tablelands of New South Wales, a place called Guyra. Have you ever heard of it?
I have not, actually. Guyra.
I'm not surprised. Little tiny place built on top of a hill, freezing cold, snows there in the winter, and about 800 people live there. You know, it's a sort of place where you don't lock your car or lock your door, where everybody knows everybody else's business. But a great little community to grow up in. And it's famous for 3 things. It's famous for the Guyra ghost, which nobody has ever seen. It's famous for the highest caravan park in Australia, which nobody stays in because it's too cold. But it's probably most famous for the most inspiring football team in the world. The Guyra football team is called the Mighty Spuds. So when you run onto the paddock to do battle in the mud and the blood and the sweat and the tears, the emblem that sits over your heart is a potato on legs. It doesn't get any more inspiring than that, mate, I don't think. And I ended up as captain of that football team, which made me Mr. Potato Head. And, that was the start of my leadership journey, mate.
Fabulous. And that was obviously the start of your sporting career as well?
Yeah, look, it's one of those country towns where there was nothing to do, so you played sport. That's all you did, you know. So I played tennis and I played golf and I played soccer and I played cricket and I played squash and I played rugby league. But rugby league was the sport that I was best at, and it gave me the opportunity to go and play football in Sydney with North Sydney, and it didn't give me the opportunity to get a scholarship to go to college, but I got a scholarship to go to college in Sydney at the same time, and that's how the working life of Rowdy McLean started.
Fabulous. And in your bio, Rowdy, you're described as a master storyteller. What is a master storyteller and what makes you particularly good at it?
Look, I think there's so much to storytelling, and the reason that's in my bio is every time I work with a company or with a speakers bureau, the feedback is, Rowdy, the people loved your stories. They loved the story about this, or they loved the story about that, and then I realised that all of my key content was anchored in stories, and so, you know, I just found that knack of conveying messages to people that were contained within a story. So, you know, sometimes there's a story about me, sometimes there's a story about something else, but being able to get your content across or your ideas across through a story, which I just did, by the way, by telling you about where I grew up. It's my natural way to default into describing a circumstance or a situation. And, I was pretty naturally good at it. I was the school captain. I was the captain of the football team. I was a kid who did the award to the teacher at the end of the year or the presentation to the footy coach. And so I didn't mind this idea of speaking and stuff and telling stories. I was the person who would regale people with stories at parties and stuff. And it wasn't really until about 2004 that I met a guy called Matt Church, and he opened my eyes to the idea that there was much more depth to storytelling. And the very first thing I used to tell a story about running a marathon, and he said to me, he said, that story is really, really good, but it'd be so much better if you started telling it on the left-hand side of the stage and finished it on the right-hand side of the stage. And I've gone, why? And he's gone, because people will move through the journey with you, like they're running the marathon from left to right. And I thought, that is so crazy. But the next time I had a speaking gig, I tried it, and I was amazed by the difference it made. And then, that really got me thinking about telling stories and being better at telling those stories. I still to this day try different things, different ways to make the story better or communicate it better. Not necessarily the story better, but to communicate it and convey the sentiment behind the story better.
It's interesting what you've just described there, just even the little nuance of moving across the stage. It's something I hadn't really thought about before. I mean, I've always thought about the way you told a story, the language you used, the pauses, the loud bits, the quiet bits, all of those kinds of things when you're telling a story. But tell me a little bit more about perhaps some of those nuances that also add to the telling of story, because when you're on stage, typically you've got a pretty flat stage and maybe a screen behind you. How do you do things that also make the story more interesting? Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think it's easier to tell a story on stage than it is over a podcast. And it's easier to tell a story over a podcast than it is in a book. So, but I think some people forget the value of being able to tell a story from the stage. And so that idea of moving left to right started me thinking about the other ways that I could use the stage. And so there's if I'm going to tell somebody there's something really, really important, like the key 60 seconds of my keynote, I'll actually walk right to the front of the stage and have my toes hanging just over the edge, like, almost stepping into the crowd. And the audience knows that whatever you're going to say when you're standing at that point, it's really, really important, and then the ability to make yourself small and large. So, being able to crouch down a little bit and then lift yourself up and make yourself tall and all of those sorts of things make a massive difference to the way that you communicate a story. And the other thing is being able to, I'm not a big fan of props on the stage, but every now and again there is something that you can use that really helps anchor the story. Like I remember working with a guy who was telling a story about, he was telling people about presenting and the art of presenting. And one of the things he talked about was frozen hand gestures. And, he would talk about it and you sort of get it, right? But then one day he did it and he had one of those snow cones, that you shake up with the snowman in it. And he put that in his hand. He said, so a frozen hand gesture is when you can hold one of these and the snow doesn't move. And it really just a great way of visually reinforcing the fact that the frozen hand gesture is a solid thing, not when I was doing frozen hand gestures, this was my frozen hand gesture, not that you can see it on a podcast, but my hand would bounce up and down. It wasn't until I saw that prop added to it that I went, if I'm going to make a point, that hand needs to be completely frozen, And so little things like that can make a massive difference to the story that you're telling.
Tell me a bit more about your storytelling journey, to attract and retain an audience. You mentioned that you sort of met Matt back in 2014, I think you said. How has that journey evolved? What made you decide to go from, you seem to have run many businesses yourself and started and turned around businesses. Where was that turning point, and when did you realize that storytelling was a big part of how to get your message across?
Look, I started the speaking journey like so many other speakers, and you're trying to work out where you fit and how your message fits and who your right audience is, and the best way for you to be good at your art, and so you've chosen this art. And for me, I discovered that storytelling was my best way of being really good at speaking. And so once I discovered that the feedback people were giving me was that they loved my stories, I went, I need to find a way to be better at those. And something that I think the most powerful thing of all in storytelling is the pause. And I say that to people, and some of the people that I mentor and coach, and they don't believe me until they give it a go. But that if you've got an audience engaged, you have to have them engaged first. But once you've got an audience engaged, the place you pause is the place where they go, whatever comes out of his or her mouth next is something that I've got to really listen to. And not only that, but it conveys the fact that you're thinking about what you're going to say next. We get so guilty, I think, of telling stories where we just done. When in fact you should relax into it. And for me, every story I tell, I can visualize in my head. And I've done thousands of keynotes now. So some of the stories I've told hundreds and hundreds of times. But every single time I tell that story, I visualize it in my head. So what the audience is watching, or what they're hearing, is me actually reliving that story in my head. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm really good at it, because they see the facial expressions that go with the memory. Like if you're thinking about a good time, then your face conveys that. And then if you're thinking about a sad time, your face conveys that. But you're not thinking about the facial expressions. Because you're actually in the story at the time. And I think that's the thing that makes the biggest difference for me, is people know that when I'm telling a story, I'm actually in the story. I'm not. The story's not a third party. Like, there's the audience, there's the me, and there's the story out here. It's just me in the story and people watching that unfold.
I think the key to a great story is being able to feel like you're standing there side by side with that person, right? So if you're conveying it in such a way that I can feel your empathy, I can feel your pain, I can feel your joy, then I'm drawn into that, right? And so there's a huge power in reliving and retelling that story in the way that you felt it. It doesn't matter if you've told it 100 times. If I can feel that story as you're saying it, then I'm more inclined to be drawn into that.
Absolutely spot on.
And I can only imagine the power of the pause would be hugely powerful, combined with the hanging your feet over the edge as well. So coming in really close, being really, maybe even lowering your voice a little bit, having that pause and telling that next thing would be a really powerful piece inside any story, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think combining some of those things, the empathy, the way you speak, the speed, the quietness, the position on stage. Tell me a bit about other forms of storytelling that you might do outside of the stage. Do you do anything else other than stage work?
Oh, look, I think once a storyteller, always a storyteller, And I mentor CEOs and business leaders outside of speaking, and I work with big leadership teams. And I think all of that mentoring, training, coaching, involves stories. Like you'll sit down with somebody and ask them about the challenges that they're facing, and they'll tell you about a challenge, and then you'll go, I've had a similar experience, and you start to tell them the story of that experience, And so I think it's, again, using something that you talked about, it's just a fantastic way of relating to people really, really well. That the share of a story of similar experience with a different result allows people to see that there's a different way forward. But it all because you start telling stories, it's almost like it's no longer a mentorship; it's a friendship, And I think it makes a big difference if you can share pertinent personal stories with somebody that you're mentoring. It engages them far, far greater than it would if it was just a purely commercial relationship. Does that make sense? Like it's just a transaction rather than a couple of friends having, for me, my mentors always say to me that when mentoring doesn't feel like mentoring to them, it feels like having a few beers at the pub with a mate. And that's how I want it to feel. I want a leader to feel like he's rung up one of his mates and let's go and have a beer, and we go and sit down, and he goes, look, geez, I've been struggling with X, and you have that conversation, or I've got this opportunity and I don't know which way to go. And so that's the way that I want it to be. And the reason it can be that way is because of the storytelling. And the other place that I've written two books. So I've written a book called Play a Bigger Game, which was my first book. And then I wrote this book, Leadability, which was my second book. Now, this book was written in conjunction with the story of me climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. And it's a leadership book, but not only does it, it's the leadership book I wish I was given the day that I started in leadership. So it's got 30 mistakes that I made that no leader should ever make, But it's also written, every chapter is written in conjunction with the experience of climbing the mountain with this guide called Stephen Malio. And so it's got two elements to it. It's a bit like a fable, but actually not. So we've got the content and then we've got the story about the mountain. Because I'm just so impressed with this guy, who was climbing the world's highest freestanding mountain in the world for a living. And then his approach to leadership and getting people to the top of the mountain. And so, there's a story in that book that lasts the whole 30 chapters as well.
In your keynote, Rowdy, you talk about 4 things you're in control of.
Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit on those, and in particular the one around actions?
So there's 4 things that all of us control, but most of us don't control. And but if we did, the world would change completely, And so those first things are, the first one is your attitude. And most people, when you ask them the question, are you responsible for your attitude, they will say absolutely. But when you ask them, are they in complete control of their attitude at any given time, on any given day, under any given circumstances, very few people put their hand up for that. But when you get to the point in life where, how you show up is completely at your control. So you don't blame your customers, you don't blame your boss, you don't blame your partner, you don't blame your kids, the dog, the neighbours, the community. When you go, I'm completely responsible for how I show up and how I behave in the world, the game changes, because you do things you would never have done when nobody else is to blame anymore. You set yourself a set of benchmarks, a set of standards, and you just, you don't take a lazy approach to life when you because I think that's the cop out for most people who are not in complete control of their attitude. Is they've got somebody else to blame. I'm allowed to be like this. It's okay for me to be like this because it's that person's or that circumstance's fault. But when you get over that, when you go, I'm completely responsible, you just play differently and you play better, and I tell a story about that includes the death of my father, and I'm not going to tell it now, but it's a long story, but it's a powerful story about, we had this disconnect with this man, alcoholic, divorced, hadn't seen him, been in contact with him for 17 years, and then we decided to show up when he was at the last few days of his life, me and my little brother, and we had the 4 best days of our life because we turned up in complete control of our attitude. Instead of carrying all the bad stuff into that experience, we carried just ourselves in our authentic selves, and so it was just a magnificent experience. And even that, I'm not going to tell the story, but even thinking about when I tell that story, one little nuance that I've changed when I tell that story is I used to start off by saying to people, I could tell you stories about attitude, how I became a professional footballer, how I became a successful business person, CEO, startup, all of those things. But the best story is the story I can tell you about the death of my dad. Changing that one line to a story I could tell you about the death of my father changed the way people embrace with the story. Because when you go, the death of my dad, people go, oh, it turns out okay, because you use the word dad. But when you go, I tell you a story about the death of my father, they sort of lean forward a little bit because they go, oh, I wonder how this turns out, And so just one word, it took me 2 years to find that one word, And so it's just finding those little things that make a story better. So that's the first thing. Own your attitude under any circumstances. The next one is make choices with purpose. And life is short. And one of my pet hates is saying to somebody, why did you do that? And they go, I don't know, it just seemed like a good idea at the time, which is just ridiculous, right? If you're going to go places in this world, and if a little country bumpkin like me can achieve everything that I've achieved, anybody can achieve just about anything. And one of the things is not accepting second best, not accepting the status quo. It's just making choices, even tiny choices, to move forward, to make progress, to grow a little bit, to find a way to make things better, and instead of just accepting how things are, choosing how you want things to be. The third one is execution. So execution is such a powerful tool, especially for leaders. And execution is doing what you say you're going to do, the way you said you're going to do it, when you said you were going to do it, every single time. That builds massive trust and integrity, right? And if once it becomes a habit, you just accelerate your progress so much because you never start out doing something and doing it halfway or half good. You go, if I'm going to execute on something, and do it with absolute integrity. And then what happens is, over the course of a few months and then a few years, people start to go, geez, this guy or this girl, they're so consistent with the way that they do things, that the way that they apply themselves, or the way that they approach things. And, that's how you get offered opportunities. That's how you get promotions. That's how you make progress. And then the last thing is the ability to stick at it longer than you think you need to, longer than your parents think you need to, longer than your partner thinks you need to, longer than your boss thinks you need to, quite often longer than you think you need to. For most of us, success is just around the corner, and we throw in the towel too early. And I think we live in this cotton wool society where we sort of learnt to throw in the towel. That it's okay to give up. It's okay to pull the pin. But the people that are successful, the Oprah Winfreys, the Richard Bransons, the Elon Musk, I can't remember the name of that girl that just won the US Open at 18 years of age. But they're the people who just keep going and stick at it long enough to make it a success.
I really love that framework, particularly all 4 sections of those, but those last 3 in particular. When I talk to people about building a tribe and building an audience and attracting potentially new clients and actually attracting or creating a business around storytelling, those last three in particular, the choices of how you show up, how, what you say, who you say it to, followed by actually executing on that, and doing the speaking gigs, writing the blogs, posting on social media, ringing people up, speaking in front of people. Whenever you get those chances to actually do those and execute them and do them consistently, and that last one, they're sticking at it. I mean, I see so many people go, oh yeah, I blogged for 3 days and it didn't work, so I moved on to social. And then I did that for a week and, that didn't work. All of these things, a lot of these things in life in general, and particularly in that space there that I speak about consistently, is you've got to do it for the long term. This is not a, short-term decision. It's a lifelong decision. It's a choice. And if you stick at it for long enough, you will start to see those results. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen, kind of thing. And it's really about those other things, and including the attitude in which you show up and actually start to present and be seen, is magnificent. So I really love that framework. So thank you for sharing that. And
you're welcome, mate.
I might steal a little bit of it when I talk about it for people, because it's very good. You wrote the book Playing a Bigger Game, and that's pretty much been your life story as well. Tell me a bit about that.
I don't know what happened to me, growing up in Gyra, whether it was the fact that it was a small country town and I wanted, I don't know, my brothers and sisters didn't want to get out of Gyra, and I didn't want to get out of Gyra because I didn't like Gyra. I was just enthralled by the idea that there's a bigger world out there, and so, the move to Sydney was a pretty big thing for me. First person in my family to go to college, first person in my school to move to Sydney. You get to Sydney and you realise there's a bigger world than that, and there's all of Australia, and then you go, there's the whole of the South Pacific, and then there's the world, and but that was the beginning of me going, there are so many experiences to be had, and so I try to mark my growth in age with different types of milestones. Like back when I was young, I used to have that. You turn 21, and like every kid in Australia, you pretty much have a party of some description and drink way too much and wake up the next day with a hangover, and then you get to 30 and you mark that milestone by going out to a restaurant and drinking way too much red wine and waking up the next day with a hangover. And you get to 40 and you've made a bit of money, and so you go up to Hamilton Island and drink cocktails till 3 o'clock in the morning and wake up the next day with a hangover. So I decided for my 50th I wasn't going to do that, and so for my 50th the morning of my 50th birthday I was standing at the peak of the world's highest freestanding mountain. And that's just a really short story about the way that I think about things. I look at the patterns that are unfolding in my life and go, which ones are stale and which ones need to change, and so the reason I go and kayak in Antarctica is because I've been having boring holidays in the same place for the last 12, 15 years, and I go, I'm going to do something different. So if I'm going to do something different, let's do something remarkably different. And so, I went over to South America, made my way down to Ushuaia, hopped on an on a Russian icebreaker and went across to Antarctica. It was a magnificent experience. Tracking gorillas in Rwanda was the same thing. Walking the Caco track, running a marathon. I woke up one day, went down and got the Sunday paper, and we're sitting there having a cup of coffee, reading the Sunday paper. And I turned the page and there's this story there about the fact that less than 1% of the entire population has ever run a full marathon. And I thought, geez, I'd like to be in that group, and I wasn't a runner or anything, but I thought, wouldn't that be a milestone, an achievement to run a full marathon? So I decided I was going to run a full marathon no matter what it took. So I did all the training and everything, turned up and ran the marathon, thinking that you run a marathon because you want the medal and the photo and the T-shirt. But my little boy met me at the halfway mark. He was 4 years old at the time, and he ran about 200 meters with me. It nearly killed him, but it was just the boost I needed, And I finished the marathon, finished in 3.5 hours, which was a pretty good time. And but I've got an experience with that little 4-year-old boy that has lasted me a lifetime. Like, he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro with me. We've become lifelong friends. So sometimes you go on these journeys of trying something that's a little bit outside the box, thinking that this is the result you're going to get, and you get something completely different. And that's the beauty, I think, about the world, is that, you get on a train and move to Sydney to go to college and play football and end up speaking to business leaders in New York 30 years later. How does that happen? What a wonderful, wonderful world that we live in.
I think it comes back to some, that a part of that framework, it's your attitude and some of those decisions, on purpose that you make throughout your life. And these stories that you now tell as part of your business is actually the experiences that you've had personally along your journey. And like you say, they don't often, often they switch and change and they evolve as you're telling the story, but the experiences and what you get out of it is not what you expected, and therefore those little nuances are the interesting parts of the story. Often it's the truck broke down on the way to trekking in Rwanda looking for the gorillas is part of that story, which you didn't necessarily expect, but makes it so much more interesting. And I think it's those decisions to just do and give it a go, which creates our lives, which creates the story of our lives, and which, then becomes interesting when you go to tell those stories.
Yeah, I think so. And I think something else you just mentioned is really important. There are stories within the stories. Like, and I used to do this with a friend of mine, where we would sit down and tell a story, and then the person would ask questions around the story, right? And then you would find the story about the truck breaking down. They go, well, you didn't mention the truck breaking down. What happened when the truck broke down? So you tell the story about the truck breaking down. They go, that's such a good story, And you hadn't even thought of it until you start to think about, what happened on the icebreaker on the way to Antarctica, or who were the characters that were there? Tell me more about the characters. What was the boat like? How was the weather? When you start to dive into it, you go, wow, there's so many stories in here. And I think the other thing is, I discovered that you don't have to tell stories exactly as they occurred. And by that, I mean, you've got to be authentic to the story. You can't change the story. But, sometimes I've got a lot of sporting stories, obviously, growing up from a sporting background. And so sometimes you're talking to an audience of people who have no interest in sport whatsoever. Right? And so you go, oh, there goes half my stories. But that's not actually the case. So, I'd tell a story about when I played football, there was a guy who got paid like 5 times more than anybody else. And we're in the final, and the other team scored a try, and we were down by a couple of points with about 2 minutes to go. And this guy who's getting paid more than everybody else is telling us to do this. You got to do this, and you got to do this. And one of the players turned around and said to me, well, you're getting paid the most. Why don't you do it? Right. So that's a good story in itself, simple story. And I've gone, well, I couldn't tell that story because it'd be really good for this audience. But then all you need to do is go, I was in this experience once where, we were struggling with getting the results that we wanted. And the leader was shouting at us to do this, to do that, and pushing us to do stuff, when in fact the best thing he could have done is got out in front of us and did the stuff, and we would have followed him. That's leadership responsibility. So you see how you take exactly the same story, take the sporting stuff out of it. It's still the same story. It's still authentic to the story. You just don't need to tell the rugby league part of it.
There's a lot of lessons in that, and I think you're absolutely correct. And I love the the flow in which a story can evolve and change, and grabbing a certain nuances within a story and maybe focusing on that part because contextually it's correct for the space that you're in. So if you're speaking to a certain crowd, then the story about the truck breaking down might be the more interesting part of the story. Whereas if you're talking to a different crowd, you might be talking about sitting with the gorillas, right? So choosing the part of the story or emphasizing the part of the story that makes sense. So I think being contextually aware of what's right at that moment could be the difference between, a great presentation and an average one, right?
Yeah. And I don't know whether you've heard of this before, but I actually have a story matrix. So I have an Excel spreadsheet, and down the left-hand side, I have all of the stories that I tell, 100 different stories. And then along the right-hand axis, I have all of the places that story would be suitable. Is it a good customer service story? Is it a good leadership story? Is it a good collaboration story? Is it a good trust story? And so, you've got these endless amount of places, but then you're able to go, you just can't tell that story about trust. It just doesn't work there. So, because when you're building a presentation, I like to make it as fast as possible. And so instead of wondering whether a story will fit or not, I just look at that matrix and go, well, here are all the stories I can tell about trust,
I think what you've described there is really interesting too, in the sense that I've heard speaker presentations, and maybe I've been lucky enough to hear them more than once. And where it falls down a little bit is if for the second time I hear exactly the same presentation and the same stories, and it feels, the second time in particular, it feels very canned and almost inauthentic. Whereas what you've just described there is you've got a set of stories that you can tell, but I'm pretty sure if I watched 2, 3, 4 different presentations of yours, yes, they might have some similarities across them, but the nuances within the stories, or the emphasis parts of the stories, or the pieces of the story might change in every presentation. Is that how you sort of treat that?
Yeah, look, I don't think I've ever done 2 presentations the same, and yet somebody who's watching them might go, they were pretty similar. But every time I do a presentation, I'm always thinking about that one word, that one that can I replace a story with a different story? Can I change the story, like changing the word dad to father, so that it fits or it's better? The best time to do that is in the first 10 minutes after you've had the presentation or you've told the story, because right then you can feel it. I can feel it in my body. I can feel that something's clunky or it didn't resonate, and so I've got a little notebook with all of my presentations in it, and at the bottom I've got, for every single presentation I've ever done, I've got three things that out of that presentation I could do differently. And sometimes it's taking a complete story and scrapping it and replacing it. Sometimes it's taking one word and replacing it. Sometimes it's thinking about where I am on the stage. Sometimes it's knowing to pause. I should have paused before I made that point. Because I love the pause. It's sometimes you can roll into a really important point in the story too quickly, and the thing about a pause is it just allows you to stop, allows the audience to go, and then it allows you to deliver that key point in a little microcosm all of its own. And so when somebody goes back to the office and the CEO says, "Oh, how was the conference?" They go, "It was fantastic." And they go, "Oh, what did you see? What did you hear?" And they go, "I heard this guy called Rowdy and he told this story." And they will use that little microcosm point that you made in between pauses. And that's how your point gets conveyed outside of the conference room or outside of the podcast.
Rowdy, I could talk to you about this stuff for 3, 4, 5 days, I think. I've totally enjoyed it. I do have a final question, however, which I do like to ask all of my guests. If someone paid you $1 million to pick your brain, but you only had 5 minutes to share some of your wisdom, what would you say to them?
Oh, to pick my brains about life, about business?
You choose.
Look, that's a fantastic question. Here's what I would say. You are capable of far more than you imagine. We live in, like, right now, things in the world are a little bit crazy, but back in 1911, people said the world's a little bit crazy, and a whole heap of other times during history, people have said the world's a little bit crazy. You are the latest, greatest model of human being that has ever existed. Your ancestors survived fire and famine and plague and predators and became better and better and better so that you could take your place in this world. And you're the best model yet, and you owe it to the next generation to make the best of what's in front of you. It's the world is your oyster, and if a little country bumpkin from Gaia can lean into it and have such wonderful experiences and such tremendous growth, I'm sure you can too. You are unbelievably amazing and capable of so much.
Rowdy, fabulous advice. I've enjoyed our chat immensely. If people want to find out a little bit more about you, where can they find you online?
Yeah, the best place to go is to www.rowdymclean.com. So ROWDYMCLEAN.com. And you can sign up to my newsletter, find my books, find my speaking presentations, find my blog, everything's there.
Rowdy, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jules. It's been fantastic.
I enjoyed having a chat with Rowdy. There's no wonder he's considered a master of storytelling. There was so much to unpack there. I could have gone on for hours with him. It was such a pleasure and such a joy to have him on. A couple of things that really stood out to me. One was his four rules to life. Own your attitude. Make choices with purpose. Execute. And stick at it. What a great 4 set. Just listening to those 4 just makes you think and stop and want to just get out and do stuff. And the other one that I really liked was that if you're going to do something different, why not make it remarkably different? Change it up a little. If it's getting a little bit stale, mix it up, go to the opposite end, and that's where some of the best stories lie. Much love. Chat soon.